Hi, welcome to History 2321 World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, we're starting session 2 of the second topic of the semester titled Mesopotamia and Egypt, the First River Civilizations. Now, in this session, we will continue covering Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, and we were looking at, in the past session, in session 1, we were looking at some of the very first innovations that Sumerian civilization brought about. The Sumerian cities we discussed in the first session that emerged, roughly speaking, as early as 4500 or 4000 BC onwards, very slowly, very gradually. Were really the pioneers of civilization in every sense of the word. They were the first ones to undergo, for example, the agricultural revolution we discussed. They were the first ones to start building canals, irrigation systems, the plow, using animals for tilling the land and the like. So they were the first ones to start innovating something new. And this is, again, agriculture. This is an agricultural revolution, large-scale farming, if you will. That gave rise, of course, to cities. As people were moving into the cities or the regions where this agricultural revolution was taking place, they started congregating together and building something new as well. This is the first time that human beings are living now in a new social setting. They're moving away from living in small nested communities and villages like in the past, in the horticultural age. And now they're moving into an area that is going to be populated by tens of thousands of people. We're looking at 20,000, 50,000 or more people living together. So this is something new, and they're going to create a city. This is an urban area populated by tens of thousands of people that are working together in many ways to build the city, to build the streets, to build the houses, for example, to build the palaces and government buildings, temples, and the like. So it's a highly organized society. Has, of course, people that are commanding the labor, that are in charge of the architectural projects and agriculture and the like. So society is becoming more and more complex. There's specialized crafts, if you will. There are, of course, priests, rulers. There are warriors, merchants, artisans, farmers, etc. Again, each performing a specific task in the society. We were also looking at other innovations, for example, monarchy. Those cities develop, of course, a state or a state system, a system of government. And initially they were theocratic, they were governed by priests, but eventually there's going to be a transformation towards monarchy around 3000 BC. We're going to see the rise of kings, divine kings, and this is reflected, of course, in the records, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh that we covered in session 1, that really discusses how kingship, divine kingship, actually took place, and what were the responsibilities of the king, and so on. We were also looking at systems of knowledge. The Sumerian cities were also known for producing the very first systems of knowledge, like astronomy, knowledge of the sky, for example, mathematics, systems of writing, for example, the cuneiform writing. We talked about the clay tablets or mud tablets and so on, in which they were really recording legal records, transactions, particularly tribute payments, taxes, for example, and the like. And of course, this is the time when they're beginning to record history. We talked about that, how this is the beginning of history, when people are actually recording events, whether they're contemporary events or past events, and leave those events, those memories for future generations. Now, we will continue our discussion on some of those innovations There's still a few innovations. Those are the very first artifacts, if you will, that produced civilization. Civilizations are places where new formations are taking place, political systems, agricultural systems, for example, social systems, systems of knowledge, but also legal systems. For example, the Sumerian cities, particularly, we're going to see this starting in one of those Mesopotamian cities. Babylon, for example, was the birthplace of the very first system of written laws. Okay, whether you want to call this a charter, again, of laws, this is, again, now a written document. Now, of course, there are no documents written on, for example, paper during this time. They're all written on tablets, once again, mud tablets. But this is the very first time in history when a ruler, Hammurabi in this case, who was the king of Babylon, and by the way, one of the reasons why he decided to write all of the laws of Babylon was because he was really expanding. The territorial domain of the city of Babylon was expanding territorially, and it was encompassing other minor cities in the area. And so Hammurabi wanted to create a standard legal code that will apply for all the realm, if you will, not only for the city of Babylon, but all the other tributary cities as well. So here we're going to see the birthplace of the very first law code. What are the laws, for example, of Babylon? And the citizens need to know what the law is. They need to understand that there are certain rules, certain legal prescriptions that everybody must follow. Otherwise, there will be consequences and punishment. You want to call it crime and punishment. Okay, so again, Hammurabi is making it clear what are the crimes of the city, what are the punishments, and also the rights of certain citizens as well. For example, rights to purchase property, the rights to own slaves, for example, and the like. All of those issues are written in the Hammurabi Law Code, as it was called. You can see here in this picture, this is an archaeological remain of the Hammurabi Code, as it was called, the Code of Laws. They're using the cuneiform writing, again, this wedge writing in which certain symbols are inscribed that denote, of course, certain concepts, ideas, and the like, again. But again, this is something new. Prior to this time, nowhere around the world were there any written laws that rulers or kings or emperors emitted for the subjects, to know and follow, etc. This is like the very early beginning, if you will, of writing a constitution, so to speak. It's nothing like a constitution, but this is the idea, the very embryonic, if you will, stage of actually writing the structure of a government, or the rules, again, of a society, the legal codes and the like. Okay? So this is an innovation that the ancient Mesopotamia takes credit for, the Hammurabi Code. Now, the Sumerian cities of ancient Mesopotamia also were known for creating the very first technologies that civilizations are going to use in order to build their societies and their economies and their political systems, and etc. So, for example, ancient Mesopotamia was the very first one to innovate, for example, the wheel. They came up with the wheel for transportation purposes. They have animals that are going to transport products or artwork, crops, etc. from one location to another. People are paying, for example, tribute from one city to another. Well, that product that tribute that they're paying to another city has to be transported. Of course, the wheel comes into being in order to facilitate, of course, the transportation of goods for tribute purposes. The sailboat as well. The very first ones to innovate the sailboat were also the Sumerian cities of southern Mesopotamia, and they're using, of course, sailboats for trade, and they're connecting, of course, their cities with other cities, for example, to the east in India and also to the west in Northeast Africa as well. There are, of course, trade connections between Egypt, Mesopotamia, but also India and Mesopotamia as well. Beer, okay? This is the very first time, again, that human beings will be fermenting certain plants. In this case, wheat is being fermented. It turns into alcohol, and this is going to be used, of course, for festivities, for leisure, for entertainment, again, for the subjects of the city, for them to actually, again, engage in the consumption of beer. And so all the knowledge of beer really comes from ancient Mesopotamia. From this region, other regions will begin to also process and manufacture beer as well around the world. Now, last but not least, there was yet another innovation that is going to be quite significant for understanding the rise of the very first civilizations, again, here in the Middle East. And that is that the Sumerian civilization was really the first one to create the very first organized religion. Highly organized religion. Of course, religion has existed. We talked about that in the past, in previous discussions, about how very early on in the Paleolithic age and Neolithic, of course, we see the rise of religious beliefs and practices. We cover that, of course. But religion in the past was not really highly organized. It was just a loose set of beliefs and practices that people carried out. It was hardly, again, the notion of, for example, an organized priesthood. There were religious figures, there were religious leaders in the past, it's true, they were carrying out ceremonies, but now what we're going to be seeing here is a highly organized religious priesthood with a very highly complex religious bureaucracy and monumental religious buildings, temples, where the priesthood is actually carrying out religious ceremonies in public in the very middle of a city, for example. This is highly organized. Now, in order to understand Sumerian religion, we must return back to the environment, the influence that the environment had on Mesopotamian religion. It actually shaped, really, the way that the ancient Sumerians actually looked at the world around them, how they conceived the nature of reality, which were the major gods, and what were the nature of the gods, for example, what was the duty, the responsibility of human beings, etc. All of that was informed by the environment. So this is really a religion of the environment in many cases, and the environment of Mesopotamia, to be more precise, because environments, of course, change from region to region. So the environment of Mesopotamia was peculiar in so many cases, and the relationship that people had with this peculiar environment is going to give rise to the very first ideas about the world that people formulated, and the kind of gods that they believed in, that they prayed to, and how they saw also their own existence as well. Now, in order to understand any religion, we must first and foremost look at the creation myths. By looking at the creation myths of any religion, we gain insights into how people actually conceived the world, how they actually interpret the universe and the cosmos and the meaning of life again. So this is very, very important. as we're going to be looking at different civilizations across the semester, we will be paying attention to the creation myths, the origin stories, the stories of creation. Because there one finds exactly what people believe the universe is. How the universe came about. Okay? What kind of world came about? Is it a good world? Is it a wicked world? And so on. Is it dangerous? Is it, benevolent? And so on. All of that is informing the creation myth that really tells us how people think, how people believe the universe came about. So it is here that we're going to see how the ancient Sumerians saw the world around them and how many of those ideas were really just interpretations from their experience with the environment. One of the key, for example, creation myths that are still they're left to us by the ancient Sumerians is called the Enuma Elish creation myth. So this is really a creation myth that pretty much tells in very general terms the kind of universe that the Sumerians lived in. Okay, and in this creation myth, as we'll see, the Sumerians really conceive initially again a universe that was kind of chaotic and erratic and unpredictable and violent, because that was precisely the kind of environment that it exists in this part of the world, and that again terrified people. In this myth, in this creation myth called the Enuma Elish, in very, very simple terms, we see the emergence, for example, in the very beginning of certain key figures. Those are gods, and those gods arise from an ocean. In other words, that in the beginning, before there was anything, they believed that there was nothingness, or there was this just ocean, if you will, that had no life, no activity, nothing in general. Again, nothing to speak of. So there was nothing, in other words. So out of nothing, we're going to see that this ocean kind of partitioned into two kinds of waters. This is the very first activity, that this ocean is beginning to take some form of activity, and those two waters were really two gods, if you will. So we see here a kind of duality, if you will. Apsu was really the god of the fresh waters, and Tiamat was the goddess of the salty waters, like, for example, the ocean, the salty waters. And they were there, and they mated, and they gave birth to a series of lesser gods. So they were like a kind of family, if you will. Okay, this is the beginning of everything. A series of lesser gods. Now, those lesser gods were also like children in so many cases. They will play and they will fight and so on with each other. And they were growing up. And at some point, the gods, the major ones, the parents, the initial ones, in this case Apsu, became very irritated about the noise of the children of those lesser gods, if you will. And so he wanted some peace, he wanted some rest, and he decided to just kill the lesser gods that they have begotten, of course. So he's now determined to pretty much put an end to all this noise and this disturbance. And as he's trying to now kill their own offspring, Tiamat, the other goddess, again, the consort of Apsu, decides to stop Apsu from killing the children, if you will, those lesser gods. And she tries to stop him. And one of the lesser gods actually rises up and confronts Apsu and kills Apsu at this point. So Apsu is killed. So you see, since the very beginning, there's a lot of violence, taking place in creation. Even the gods, the nature of the gods are violent, in other words. So one of the major gods dies. And so Tiamat now is really disconcerted at this event. She's really angry. She becomes extremely angry at the fact that, one of the gods actually kills the father, in this case, Apsu. And she decides to reprimand them and go to war against them. So there's a war amongst the gods as well. So they're warlike as well. You can see that even the forces that control the universe are violent and they go to war with one another. They battle, in other words. And so in this commotion, what happens is that Tiamat becomes an agent of chaos. There's a lot of disturbance in creation. Goes to war with the gods, and she's really, again, the embodiment of chaos. The whole world is unstable, and the whole creation, again, has become a battlefield, and she's deciding, again, to pretty much kill the lesser gods. Now, one of those gods, Marduk, one of those lesser gods, Marduk, rises up. He now commands all the other lesser gods to defeat Tiamat, and through his strength and will and determination and skill, he's able, Marduk, to actually defeat Tiamat. Chaos, in other words. And Tiamat is subdued by Marduk. So this is, again, a myth that tells that in the beginning of the world was chaos. The gods were at war, and ultimately one of the gods end up actually bringing order to creation, Marduk, and he becomes the king of the world. He becomes really the king of the universe, and he brings order. And one of the ways that he brings order is that after killing Tiamat, he actually partitioned the body in half. One of the half of Tiamat becomes the sky, the heavens, and the other half becomes the earth. So again, he's really the creator of heaven and earth. When the world was in chaos, when chaos was defeated, suddenly we see some form of order, some form of organization. Heaven and earth. Marduk is now the chief god, of course, of ancient Sumeria. He's considered to be the one that brought order, created heaven and earth, and also created the very first man and the very first city. And he also creates the institution of kingship in the heavens. In other words, that divine kingship actually comes from the heavens, and it comes to the city as well. So again, the king of the city, in many cases, is really the embodiment of Marduk in so many cases, that he is indeed in charge of creating stability and order within the city as well. Okay, and kings saw themselves in that light as well, that they were really trying to create order. Just like in the beginning of time, order had to be created, and a strong man had to rise up in order to bring order in creation, and he becomes the king of the world. Well, also here on earth, human beings are trying to do the same thing as well. Whenever there's disorder, whenever there's violence or chaos, etc., the king must rush to the scene and actually impose order and defeat chaos as well. So again, this is a civilization that, because of the environment, because the environment is very, very erratic, very violent. There's violent floodings. We talked about that in session 1. In this part of the world, the rivers overflow unpredictably and they create floodings. And remember, everything is made from mud. In ancient Sumeria, all the cities are made from mud. Even the technologies are made from mud and so on. So whenever the rivers overflow, they end up dissolving everything. Okay, it's not that the crops are destroyed, but also the houses are totally decimated. The palaces, everything disappears from sight. It's total destruction. And this happened, once again, very violently, very erratically, and unpredictably. So the environment, again, is a source of terror for the ancient Sumerians. So they believe that this is the nature of the gods. In other words, the gods are in nature. They're very violent and very capricious. And without warning, they can send a flood and they can destroy everything in their wake. The waters in that overflow from the two main rivers. So, from their own perspective, there's chaos in the world. There's chaos. And there's a yearning, there's a longing for order, and you can see that in the myths, for example, of creation, and also how, as humans, as they're creating their civilization, they think that this is the most important goal for human beings to accomplish, to accomplish an orderly existence, of course, to bring order, perhaps even bring order in nature, although it is very hard, perhaps even impossible, to win a battle against the gods. Nonetheless, this is how they conceive the world. Now, the ancient Sumerian religion also produced myths about floodings, of course, myths that later on were absorbed by other societies in ancient Mesopotamia. And you can see that many of the other societies that lived in this region north of Sumeria are going to take some of those tales and rework them and made them their own. There's a number of Mesopotamian myths that come from ancient Sumeria that are found, for example, in the biblical stories that also talk about floodings and floods as well. This is something that we're very familiar from the story of the Bible of the flood that ended up destroying most of humanity except a family, Noah, for example. This comes from the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, but even the Hebrew Bible came much, much later, about 2,000 years later, after this original myth about a flood was actually written by the ancient Sumerians. So again, this myth about floods is very, very, very ancient, even ancient to the ancient Hebrews, in other words. So, again, this is a region that will constantly experience floodings that will end up destroying entire cities. Again, this is something that occurred from time to time, and this was, a source of terror. It was a source for even a constant depression for a lot of people, just losing everything, losing their crops, their animals, their livelihood. Everything was, dissolved in a heartbeat by the forces of nature. Now, for example, there is a myth of ancient Sumeria called the Genesis, for example, that talks about the story of the flood. And this was actually written more or less about 3000 BC. There are earlier, of course, myths, but once again, most of the archaeological record has been destroyed. We have just fragments, if you will, of those myths in earlier records. But by 3000, there's plenty of records that tells, of course, the story of a flooding, again, that end up killing humanity. Now, according to the myth, once again, we see how the ancient Sumerians saw the universe, and they saw the universe once again as a very dangerous place in which chaos was always threatening to overrun order. So the myth tells the story when the gods actually created once again the universe, etc., and then left human beings on their own, pretty much, to live in the world. And the gods were considered, once again, very capricious, very uncaring. They were not really, in charge of people's lives whatsoever. They didn't really care, as a matter of fact. And at one point, the gods became very, very irritated about the noise that human beings were making. That, human beings were becoming more numerous. The world population grew exponentially, and that humans were making so much noise that they were not letting the gods rest. And so, because they were so irritated and frustrated by humans, they decided to send a flood. Imagine. So, here, we're not talking about, oh, well, human beings became wicked and they started harming each other, and that's why the gods decided to destroy them. It was nothing like that. Okay, it was nothing about, people are sinning or they're wicked or they're evil. It's just that they're making so much noise and they're not letting their gods rest. And just willy-nilly, the gods just send the flood to destroy them. Of course, they chose a survivor. They chose an individual to actually survive the flood, and he was given immortality. Now, the ancient Hebrews who lived in this area, once again, the ancient Hebrews are coming out. They were a nomadic group that came out of ancient Sumer. They were wanderers and shepherds, and eventually they settled, of course, in a land that they built, of course, ancient Israel. But they had absorbed most of the culture of ancient Sumeria, and they reworked some of their myths and made them their own, and they wrote, of course, the story of the Bible, of the Genesis. Again, when humans became wicked, God sent the flood to destroy them and save just one family, Noah, for example. But you can see quite clearly, how the ancient Sumerians actually saw the world, by looking at some of their myths, for example, the Eridogenesis. There are other, of course, stories and legends that they wrote, in which it's very interesting to note, for example, when we look at for example, the Sumerian king list. This is another mythic story or legend that talks about the pre-flood Sumerian rulers and cities. In other words, they are leaving certain records about the time before the flood, and this is called the Sumerian king list. And there's a series of kings that ruled cities in the ancient world before the flood, and they go back hundreds of thousands of years. So for them, human history is really, really ancient, really, really old. This is very interesting to note, because the ancient Sumerians are not the only ones who wrote stories about humanity that go back hundreds of thousands of years old. Meaning that, from their standpoint, humanity did not start, the Homo sapiens, 200,000 years ago. The way modern science actually indicates. We talked about that in the first topic. Homo sapiens are coming out of Africa about 200,000 years ago. Again, the modern day human. So it's not that old, according to science. But according to the mythologies of ancient civilizations, humanity goes back in time hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of years ago, and there were other highly advanced civilizations that human beings created in the past. Again, so the Sumerian king list is just an example of that. That those ancient societies can actually provide names of individuals that ruled cities. They can provide, of course, descriptions of how societies were like before they were destroyed. And they will explain, for example, the reason why we don't have any record of those kinds of worlds, those kinds of civilizations that existed in the past. We consider them myths. The reason, again, that those stories explain why we don't find them anymore is because of the flood. The flood ended up destroying them, in other words. Okay. Now, there's another myth I want to discuss that is also found in the biblical stories of the Hebrew Bible. Again, the stories of the Hebrew Bible. And that is the story of Adam and Eve. In the Hebrew Bible, we learn that Adam and Eve, for example, were the very first human beings created in a garden, and they were left there by God. God had to step out for a while and told them not to eat from a forbidden tree, the apple, for example, and so on. This is the story of the genesis of humanity. Now, in that story, it is said that Adam was created first. God created Adam first, and out of Adam, he took, one of the ribs of Adam to create Eve. Now, this story that appears in the Bible was actually taken from an older, much older story that the ancient Sumerians formulated. Again, it was a myth about the very first gods of creation, Enki and Ninhursag, as she was called, Ninhursag. In the beginning, according to this very ancient Sumerian myth, there were two gods. Enki was male, Ninhursag was actually female. Enki was the god of the waters, Ninhursag was the god of the earth. They were in a kind of paradise, so to speak. And they mated and produced a series of lesser gods as well. Now, at some point, Enki started misbehaving and seducing the lesser goddesses in this case. And so Ninhursag got very irritated at that kind of behavior. And she was really growing really mad at Enki. And at one point, Enki decided to go into a garden where she had some special fruits, some special trees. He was not supposed to eat from those trees. He was told not to eat from those trees, and he decided to actually eat the flowers and the fruits of all those trees that were forbidden in this case. Ninhursag at this point, had enough, and she's actually sent some curses to Enki and got him really ill. 8 parts of his body became really diseased. And as he was about to die, one of the lesser gods came in and said, we have to save Enki. If he dies, there will be no life in the world. So Ninhursag then gave birth to 8 healing goddesses. 8 healing goddesses to heal the different parts of Enki's bodies that were diseased. One of those goddesses was the goddess of life, and she healed the rib of Enki. Okay, so she was the goddess of life in this case, that gave life in this case. So you can see this is a very similar story that the ancient Hebrews that obtained the story kind of reworked it, and they were able to change, if you will, the order, some of the characters. And here we see, of course, the story of Adam and Eve, how from Adam, Eve was created from the rib in this case. And the name Eve, again, is also the giver of life. Again, the meaning of the word Eve is also life, the giver of life. Very similar to the goddess of life that healed Enki's rib as well. Again, so we are gaining some insights about the Mesopotamian religion by looking at their myths, how they see the world, how it was created, but also how many of those stories end up also absorbed by other groups of Mesopotamia, which produce, of course, scriptures like the Old Testament. Now, in very general terms, what is the Mesopotamian religious worldview? How can we really break it down and identify it? Well, first and foremost, from the myths, from the main ideas of the religion, we learn that the ancient Sumerians believe in a very chaotic world. The world is chaos. It's chaotic because, without warning, we experience natural catastrophes. The environment is violent. There's violent storms, thunder, and the rivers overflow, and they end up pretty much dissolving cities and the like. So it's very chaotic. Okay? So first and foremost, this is how the ancient Sumerians actually see it. Again, it's a very chaotic, violent world. The gods are the gods of nature. Okay, so the major gods are the gods of nature. The major gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon are Shamash, for example, the sun god. And there were many versions of Shamash. There were about 4 different kinds of sun gods, across the Sumerian cities. Ishtar, She's the earth goddess. She's really the mother of the world, if you will, and she's the goddess of fertility. She's worshipped for fertility, for crops, etc. And she was worshipped at the beginning of spring. The beginning of spring was the beginning of the renewal of life, so to speak, when the earth was giving birth, if you will, to vegetation and the like. This is where we get, again, the term today of the celebration around the early spring called Easter. When we celebrate Easter today, this is a celebration that comes from ancient Sumeria, the celebration of Ishtar. Again, the beginning of spring, the beginning of fertility and the like, we celebrate it in a very modified form, but this is a very, very ancient agricultural celebration to the goddess Ishtar. Okay? There's also Ningrisu, the Lord of Floods. He is, of course, in charge of thunder. He's in charge of lightning and storms and rain, etc. And people pray to this god in the hopes that he will control, again, the floodings. It was an attempt to try to create some order, if you will, by praying to this god. And Tammuz. Tammuz was the god of vegetation. He's the god, again, of crops and everything that grows, again, in the wild as well. Tammuz. Once again, the gods are not benevolent. They're unpredictable. They're violent. They're capricious. And they're uncaring as well. They don't really care about human beings. They're just capricious. Sometimes they get irritated and they send those very violent catastrophes. So why people will pray to them to begin with, well, was for the hopes of appeasing them, to appease the gods. Not for salvation. People were not really thinking about, I'm going to go to heaven and hopefully by praying to the God I'm going to. No. It's just that whenever they needed something or to appease them, for them not to destroy you again, they will actually pray to them and confer offerings. Every city had a god that was the god of the city, and it was one of the gods that I mentioned. It was really one of the gods of the environment. It can be the sun, for example, the earth, Ishtar, the floods, or the vegetation. In very general terms, what this religion reveals is that the entire culture of Mesopotamia was very pessimistic. In other words, that they did not really consider life a blessing, for example. This is something that we're enjoying. This was a gift of the gods for us to actually enjoy our existence and so on. They consider life to be short, to be unpredictable, to be very uncertain, and that there was nothing much to accomplish except just survive. People were just trying to survive in the environment, which was really working against them in many cases. Even the vision of the afterlife. At this point, there's no concept of heaven and hell. There's not a place of reward or punishment. In this case, they were just trying to get by, trying to survive. And the afterlife was seen as a place where there was bleak, was grim. There was really nothing to accomplish. People would just get very, very bored in a desert eating mud. That was the vision of the afterlife. So when people died, they will go to this very, very bleak, dark place where there was nothing and it was just mud, and people would just be sitting there totally bored, doing nothing, and just eating mud. Again, so it reveals the kind of worldview that people actually believed in, or the kind of world that they inhabited. We see also the beginning of the very first religious temples. With this highly organized religion, we see the priesthood that was in charge of the cults to the gods that I mentioned, building the very first religious temples. And by the way, the environment is also significant for understanding the architectural designs, the temples that ancient Sumeria produced. Well, at some point, the ancient Sumerians were able to detect where the water that was feeding the rivers was coming from. They were able to discover that the mountains were the places where the storms happened and where all this water came rushing very violently into the rivers, causing the massive floodings. So they believe that if this is the case, if the storms start in the mountains, and this is where all the water is coming from and the destruction, then the mountains must be the home of the gods. This is where the gods are. They're in the mountains, in other words. So what they started doing is that they started building replicas of the homes or the house of the gods by building a mountain in the very middle of the city. This is going to be the house of the gods. They're going to build figurines, again made from mud for the most part, and actually place them inside of this little mountain, if you will, called the ziggurat. The ziggurat was an artificial mountain. It was an artificial mountain because this is the home of the gods. The gods live in the mountains. Well, we're going to make actually a home for the gods, and we're going to pray to them. We're not going to go to the mountain to pray to them, but rather here, and we're going to petition again things like good crops or regular floodings because they're violent and so on again. So this is again what the new religion, if you will, of Mesopotamia is giving rise to, again, the so-called ziggurats. And there are, of course, a number of ziggurats being built across Mesopotamia. And this was the typical temple where people assembled and they prayed to the gods, and there were public ceremonies, of course, conducted before the community. The priesthood is gaining, of course, significant power in this new society because they're controlling the religion. And the religion for those ancient societies is everything. This is providing meaning to their existence. This is how they attempt to control the environment. And this is where people actually pay tribute to the gods. So when people go to the temple, they have to pay tribute to the gods, give gifts to the gods, and of course the priests receive the gifts. And that is a source of, again, treasure or wealth for the priesthood. Now, another very peculiar, from our perspective, element of the religious temples is that every temple had concubines. We talked about in the Epic of Gilgamesh about the temple prostitutes, for example. In ancient Sumer, as it was in ancient Mesopotamia as a whole, in all of the cities that flourish across this region, the ziggurats, or the temples, again, were also places where women there as the concubines of the gods. Those were actually women that gave themselves up, or sometimes even their families actually went to the temple to offer their own daughters to the temple so they can serve the gods in every possible way, or serve the representatives of the gods, the priest. And of course, this was not seen as something negative. As a matter of fact, it was considered to be, an honor for the people, for the families, for example, the parents of those girls, or even the girls themselves. This was considered something virtuous, something actually lofty, to do. Give their lives to the gods, being in the temple, and of course, they will practice something called sexual magic. In this case, something that was practiced, in ancient Sumer. Something that, of course, we don't have a lot of knowledge about that, but the practices were considered magical. The practices were considered religious. It was considered a religious activity. The kind of activities they perform, the sexual activities, inside of the temple. So this is another aspect of ancient Sumer, again, the participation of women, again, in the religion, but as concubines, of the gods. Okay, so Mesopotamia, of course, is a very interesting case study due to the fact that, again, it is really a place where gave rise to the very first civilizations, but they're taking shape in a very unique way. Now, the other civilization we're going to cover in part 2 is Egypt. Egypt is another civilization, another river civilization that was emerging almost simultaneously with ancient Sumer. They're neighbors, they're very close to each other, but they're going to be very, very different in so many respects, in their orientation, in their religion, in how people live, the environment, for example, and so on, is going to be totally different despite of their proximity. Now, Egypt in the ancient world was known as Kemet. Kemet means black land. Again, black land referred to the kind of soil along the banks of the river where the civilization flourished, was a very dark type of soil that was really the source of nourishment, that was the fertilizer, if you will, of all the crops that people produced on the banks of the river Nile. So people call it Kemet, as a matter of fact. This was the original name of Egypt. Okay, Egypt came much, much later, of course, after its founding. Now, just like I explained how Mesopotamia was built upon the central notion of order out of chaos, in Egypt, the underlying or underpinning idea behind the religion, the political system, the society, the culture, was balance and harmony. You know, people, the general perception, again, of living in Egypt was that life was about balance and harmony. They experienced a different kind of universe. This is a different worldview altogether, that in which people actually experience a very orderly, very balanced, and very harmonious creation, including the gods are very harmonious and very balanced as well. So it's quite different, quite the opposite of ancient Mesopotamia. Now, in order to understand ancient Egypt, or Kemet for that matter, we need to look at the geography. The geography is going to provide a lot of clues as to how people experience their lives in general. Okay, the geographical setting, again, provides pretty much the setting for understanding the society, the religion, the political system, the culture. The geographical setting of ancient Egypt, first and foremost, we have to understand that the life system, the lifeblood of the entire civilization came from the river Nile. Okay? It is the largest river in the world, as a matter of fact, the Nile. It is called the gift of the Nile due to the fact that because of this river, this region was able to generate life, whether we're talking about animals, vegetation, and also human societies. Because without this river, this region would have just been desert. Okay? Just plain desert, because when we look at the geography, for example, of Egypt, it is really, Egypt is just a strip of land where people actually generated their temples, their pyramids, their settlements, and their farms. It's just a narrow, very narrow strip of land where Egypt emerged, just along the river. Because when we look at the entire region on both sides, it's just desert on both sides. Uninhabitable, I should say, desert. So the climate is rather hot, humid, but along the Nile, the climate tends to be really, really nice. It is hot and humid, but it's very pleasant. But once you leave the Nile, once you move into this, for example, you move westward into the Saharan desert, the climate is going to become pretty much scorching hot, uninhabitable, So this is why it's called the gift of the Nile. This is the longest river in the world. It originates in the southern part of Egypt, all the way in a region of Central Africa. It's a mountainous region. Once again, the mountains are the originators, really, of the largest rivers of the world. Water that falls through seasonal rainfalls is funneled into those rivers. So it starts in Central Africa, and the water is funneled into this river, and so it slowly moves north, and as the water is actually moving up north, it overflows during summertime, but the overflowing is really gradual and it's really manageable as well. This is the opposite of the two rivers of Mesopotamia, that they overflow very violently and they end up pretty much destroying cities and the like. Nothing of that sort happens here. This is a very noble river. It's the largest river in the world, it's true, but it's very noble because it is very predictable. Every year during summertime, around, let's say, starting around June, we see the waters starting to rise along the Nile, and it rises very gradually, and people are able to actually build irrigation systems, canals, and being able to actually funnel the water very easily, very gracefully as well, into their farms as well. So it's very gracefully. So it flows up north, and once it reaches the Mediterranean Ocean, as you can see, it starts to break apart into a series of minor rivers. It's called the Nile Delta. And finally, all this water ends up in the Mediterranean Ocean, again in the north. This is the Mediterranean Sea. Now, another characteristic of this geographical setting is that the winds blow south. Well, the water is moving up north from the mountainous regions of Central Africa, but the wind is actually blowing from north to south. So what we're going to see here is that this river also provided the right conditions for navigation. Although the water is moving up north, merchants and farmers and so on could actually move products along the river from the north to the south because the winds were actually pushing them south, despite the fact that the water was moving up north. So it was a river that could be managed in so many ways, for farming, for example, for transportation, for trade, and so on. Again, provided easy access, in other words. So first and foremost, again, the geography is providing pretty much, an understanding of the kind of society we're going to look at here. And Egyptian society, Egyptian civilization, is arising on the banks of the rivers where agriculture could develop quite easily. The land is going to be very productive due to the fact that, as I mentioned, during the seasonal rains, again, that occurred during summertime, most of the minerals, for example, that are contained in the mountains were flushed down through those seasonal floodings, if you will, and all of those minerals ended up in the river. Is a very dark, matter, if you will, that got into the water, and this dark mineral, if you will, which is nutrient, is a fertilizer, ends up in the farms, again, of the Egyptians, if you will. So even the fertilizer is coming along with the water every season, again, every seasonal flooding, which is very gentle and very graceful as well during summertime. So the river was considered to be a purveyor of life. It was bringing life to the region. It was bringing water. It was bringing nourishment, fertilizer, and so on, easily available for people. And along the river, we're going to see lush vegetation, plenty of fertile ground for crops, and of course, humans, of course, are beginning to form their farms and settlements along it, along the river, along the banks. Okay, so first and foremost, understanding the Nile is important of how people are going to form their ideas about the world. And of course, if you live in this part of the world, in the ancient world, you interpret life as to be a blessing. Life, again, is a blessing because, look, nature is very orderly. It is giving us all the essentials of life. It gives us water. It gives us crops in a very orderly manner. We can actually predict when this is going to happen, and it happens in the same time every single year. And there's no experience of violence, again, from nature. You know, nature is not violent in this part of the world as it is in ancient Mesopotamia. Let me scroll down here. Now, the other factor is the sun. The sun is the other factor that provides also an influence into the kind of world that the Egyptians interpreted. The sun, of course, is also very orderly, is responsible for agriculture, of course, the seasons, for example, the 4 seasons. You can see, for example, the sun rising in the east, setting in the west. You can start forming a calendar. You can start actually counting the days of the solar year, and you're understanding when, again, the different seasons takes place based on those calendars. So it seems that the world is like this clock that is very orderly, very balanced, and the sun is giving life as well. The sun is responsible for, agriculture, and this is something that is very, very synchronized. You can time the cycles of the sun. You can predict the cycles of the sun. So therefore, this is giving rise to this idea that there's order in the universe. There's balance and there's harmony as well. So the sun is the second factor that influenced Egyptian civilization. So much so that once we get again into that point, the sun god will become one of the major, of course, gods of the Egyptian pantheon. Okay. Also, the geographical location of ancient Egypt can also provide clues about the kind of civilization they created. This is a civilization that was protected by the natural environment on all fronts. Okay. For example, to the west, we have the Saharan desert that acts as a constraint, let's say, for other societies to invade Egypt. This is a long desert to cross. So they're protected by this desert. To the west, they're protected by the desert to the east. That includes the Arabian, of course, desert and the Red Sea. This is another constraint that prevents people from actually invading Egypt from the east. There's the mountainous regions from the south of Africa as well. That makes it also difficult for marching armies to move into Egypt from the south. And of course, the Mediterranean Sea from the north also protects Egypt as well. They act as barriers. So this helped Egypt sustain a civilization that lasted for thousands of years in a very stable way. This is, again, a civilization that had a long continuity for about 3,000 years of continuity. Continuous development, continuous political systems with, of course, minor interruptions sometimes, of course, but it had a continuity, this civilization, that spanned for thousands of years. And one of the reasons that explains that is the geography, that it was an isolated civilization that was protected by nature, by the geography. Okay? So this is, again, important, how this is going to help give rise to those ideas about balance and harmony. So this is a river civilization. Ancient Egypt, it is a river civilization like ancient Sumer, for example, in which there is, of course, an agricultural revolution taking place in the Nile, just like we saw that in ancient Sumer as well. The agricultural revolution, in which people are building, of course, irrigation systems. They're using the plow, they're using ox and cattle in order to till the land and the like. We see, of course, the formation of countless farms along the banks of the Nile. All this farming that is taking place, this revolution, so to speak, in agriculture is taking place along the banks of the Nile. And once again, is very, very gracious, very noble, the river, and very predictable. And again, it's very easy to work with. You can plan when you're going to prepare the soil for cultivation, when plant the seed, at the time when, of course, there will be water coming in by June every year, and so on. Again, this is very, very predictable. The planting cycle, of course, begins during spring, the preparation of the fields, and so on. And this is a time when the river is getting dried up again. Before the flooding, the river is actually kind of subsiding to the point that it seems that it's kind of drying up. But the Egyptians came to learn rather quickly that this was just a signal for the coming of the rain seasons and, of course, the overflow of the River Nile. So they're preparing the fields for cultivation during springtime. Then here arrives the water in June, and from June all the way to October, for example, we have plenty of water that is being funneled and channeled into the farms. And after October, we see yet another season, and that is, of course, the winter season, where the river begins to slowly and very gradually starts to recede and subside. Of course, that's another cycle. So those are natural and seasonal irrigation patterns that the ancient Egyptians actually followed in order to create this agricultural revolution. They're all following the rhythms of the Nile, the rhythms of nature, in order to create this change. And of course, their entire economy is based on agriculture. This is an agricultural economy in which the main source of nourishment are the crops that people are producing, and this is what is being taxed as well. All the revenues, for example, all the products, that must be paid to the overlords, in this case the pharaoh. We're going to talk about the political system and the like. Again, are in the form of crops. Again, this is what sustains the Egyptian economy and the Egyptian society and political system. Is agricultural production, tribute, taxes, and the like are all coming again from the agricultural production. Now, there is a formative period of ancient Egypt. Before there was something called the Unified Kingdom, in other words, the Kingdom of Kemet or Egypt. There was a formative period in which this region was really divided between two major areas or major regions, what is called Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, Upper and Lower Egypt don't follow the necessary geographical concepts of what upper, like north, and lower, south, but rather it was the reverse. Upper Egypt was the south, and this refers to the mountains again of the south. That's why it's called the upper, the highlands, in other words. Upper Egypt was a mountainous region, again, that where the rains generated. In other words, that was considered one of the regions again prior to the rise of Egyptian civilization. Lower Egypt are the lowlands to the north. So the northern part of Egypt, again, are the lowlands. So this is called Lower Egypt. Okay? And during this time, before there were any cities, before there were any temples and pyramids, what do we call a civilization, or a kingdom for that matter, with a ruler on top, the pharaoh, and the like, people live along the Nile in small nested communities. So it was not unified. In other words, people were simply conducting their lives by engaging in farming for the most part, and there were no centralized authority during this time. Again, what you see in this map, the pyramids and the different ceremonial cities, are going to come much, much later once Egypt attains unification. Egypt, before unification, did have some form of political organization. There were districts. Before the rise of the Kingdom of Egypt, There were nomes, as they were called. The nomes. The nomes are districts. Those were small regions, if you will, inhabited by communities that were led or governed by the nomarch, as he was called. The nomarch was like the chief of the community. Okay, and there were dozens and dozens of those nomes scattered across the Nile. Again, people were carrying out their daily lives in total isolation. In many cases, there was some interaction with them in terms of trading goods and so on. But in reality, they were all independent. They were self-governed, self-ruled, totally independent, and they were just forming themselves, if you will, across this time in the formative period, building their communities, their farms, and the like. Okay, so the nomes are considered to be the very first stages of Egyptian civilization, the very first stepping stones towards the rise of that civilization. Okay, you can see along the Nile the different nomes, if you will, again, that appeared, that existed in the ancient world. Okay, dozens and dozens of them, each governed by a nomarch or the chief of that community, of that nome or district. Those were not cities by any means. Those were just communities, if you will, or districts. At some point, we're going to look at the unification of Egypt. There will be a unifying process where the lower and upper regions are going to come together and merge and form a unified kingdom, so to speak. And there will be, of course, an individual that is going to be the central authority, the ruler of the land, that is unifying all parts of what is called Egypt today. The individual that is credited for accomplishing this was an individual by the name of Menes. He was also known as Nermer. Okay, Menes or Nermer. According to records, he lived about 3100 BC. So we're talking about, again, a very, very early stages of civilization. When we see, for example, the rise of Sumer, for example, of Sumerian cities and the like, we also see at the same time in this part of the world, in Northeast Africa, again, the attempt to start creating also a civilization by Menes. He is the founder of one of the very first cities of ancient Egypt. It was the city of Memphis. So this is now, again, one of the rising or the pioneer cities. Memphis, again, is going to be one of the most dominant centers, political centers of all this region. And the founder of the city was Menes or Nermer. And he's going to be the one that is going to unify all of the nomes, all of the different communities. He's going to bring them together. He's coming from Upper Egypt, meaning he's coming from the south, from Memphis, and he's now trying to unify Lower Egypt, the north, by conquest. So he raises a small army, he goes to Lower Egypt, the northern region, and he's able to subdue Lower Egypt and bring it together with Upper Egypt, bring them together and create the very first unified kingdom of Egypt. Roughly speaking, about 3500 BC. And he becomes the king of the two lands. As a matter of fact, some of the titles that the pharaoh was given was really the king of the two lands. Okay, the pharaohs. So he's really the founder of the institution of kingship. He's the first king, and the title of the king, of course, in Egypt is the pharaoh, the Egyptian pharaoh. The pharaoh is referred as the king of the two lands. And this can be seen or is reflected by the type of crown that the pharaohs used in the past. It was a double crown. Okay, it was really a double crown. They will wear, for example, one crown first. The Upper Egypt, the south, was the crown you can see here in this depiction right here. It was really the Upper Egypt, the crown of Upper Egypt in the south. And of course, there will be another crown placed on top of that from Lower Egypt from the north. It was a dual crown. One was represented by a vulture, the Upper Egypt, and the Lower Egypt was represented by a snake. There were two animals, two different animal species that symbolize the two regions of Egypt coming together in the figure of the pharaoh. Okay, and the pharaohs will always appear with a double crown, always in all the inscriptions, in the hieroglyphs and so on, that are survived today in murals, for example, in temples, in inscriptions. And you can see the double crown of the pharaohs that symbolize the union of those two lands, the double crown of Egypt. All right, so at this point, we're going to see the very beginning of the different stages of Egyptian civilization. Of course, Menes is the one that actually unified, of course, the two regions, create one. He initiates the first institution of monarchy or kingship, is the institution of the pharaoh. But it's not until 2600 thereabouts BC, 2686 more or less, again, the beginning of what is called the Old Kingdom. This is now giving rise to now Egyptian history with plenty of records that provides clues that there was a period of time now with the unification of Egypt that is giving rise to something called the Old Kingdom. It spanned for about 500 years all the way to the 2100s BC. This is considered the golden age of Egypt. Okay, the golden age of Egypt. The golden age of Egypt begins. This is a time when finally we have now a pharaoh governing the entire realm and is recognized as such. It's not just recognized as a king. The pharaoh is actually recognized as a living god by this time. Okay, so this is not just a king in the ordinary sense of the word that had unified both sections, but rather this is really a divine being. This is a living god, and he comes from the major gods of the Egyptian religion, something we're going to get to once we get to, again, the section on religion. He is the supreme priest, the highest priest of the realm, which means that he's governing along a council of priests as well. Religion will constitute a central aspect of Egyptian life. This is not a secondary option, a secondary issue for the ancient Egyptians. Religion was central to people's lives in general. It was central to the economy, to the political system, to everyday life. Even the purpose of human existence was all centered again on the Egyptian religion. Most of the work that people did was to serve the gods and to serve the pharaoh and the like, you know. So he's governing, of course, with a group of priests who are in charge, of course, of the temples and the ceremonies. So we can also look at the type of government that flourished very early on as a theocracy. This is a theocracy. It is, of course, a monarchy. It's a divine monarch. You have a pharaoh who's a living god. But at the same time, the priests are also in control of the government, and many of the functions of the government are carried out by priests. So this is also a theocracy as well. The responsibility of the pharaoh was to impart divine justice And this divine justice is not really coming from the Pharaoh's own analysis of the world, from his own ideas, but rather is coming from the goddess of wisdom. It's called Ma'at. Ma'at is the goddess of wisdom. The Pharaoh is in communication with Ma'at, or the goddess of wisdom. And out of this communication, the Pharaoh receives knowledge, receives wisdom, receives guidance from the goddess of wisdom in order to rule the kingdom. So his responsibility is to impart divine justice. I mean, this is again law coming from the gods, the goddess of wisdom, and he's simply the representative of the goddess of wisdom in this case. Okay, most of the decrees, the laws, and the rules that the Pharaoh ordained and enforced were considered to be, wise pronouncements, wise measures in order to create balance and harmony in the world. His responsibility is to create balance and harmony, upholding Ma'at, or divine justice. Okay. Now we have, of course, reached the end of today's class. It's an hour and 20 minutes, so we're going to make a stop here. When we return in session 3, we will continue talking about Egyptian political system. We will talk about, again, the Old Kingdom, how the government was structured, what were the main duties, the responsibility of the different officials. We will look at the Egyptian religion. We will look also at the ceremonial cities, the pyramids, the purpose of the pyramids, and so on. And we will look at the other subsequent eras of Egyptian history, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and at the end, we will look at a comparison between Egyptian civilization and Sumerian civilization when we come back. This is all I have for you. I'll see you then when we come back in session 3. Thank you.